They fired the janitor on a Tuesday. Well, not fired. Silas died on his shift, face down next to the industrial shredder in basement level 4 of Aegis Healthcare. The paramedics took 40 minutes to navigate the maze of loading docks to find him. By the time they zipped him up, his body was already stiffening under those cheap fluorescent lights that always buzz like a nest of angry wasps. I watched the whole thing from my data entry desk, 20 feet away, chewing a piece of cinnamon gum until my jaw physically ached. Nobody from upper management came down. Just a cleanup crew smelling heavily of bleach and synthetic green apple air freshener. 2 days later, a suit from Human Resources showed up with a cardboard box to clear out Silas's locker. He scooped up a greasy uniform and a pair of worn steel-toe boots, tossing them straight into the dumpster. But the suit missed something. Before the paramedics arrived, before anyone even knew the old man's heart had stopped, I found his brass Zippo lighter lying on the cold concrete. Silas didn't even smoke. I slipped it into my pocket. I didn't know it yet, but that lighter was hollow, and what was inside it was going to tear this whole company to the ground. I worked the graveyard shift because it paid an extra $1.50 an hour. When you're drowning in medical debt, every quarter looks like a life raft, and I was holding my breath at the bottom of the ocean. My mother's kidneys were operating at 11%. That's a number that gets burned into the back of your eyelids. 11%? She needed dialysis 3 times a week. And every single month, Aegis Healthcare, the very company I spent 40 hours a week bleeding my soul into, found a new, creative, bureaucratic loophole to deny her coverage. I spent my nights from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. staring at a glowing monitor, processing claim rejections for people exactly like her. The irony wasn't lost on me. It tasted like battery acid in the back of my throat every time I hit the deny button. I was a microscopic cog in a massive machine designed to grind sick, desperate people into quarterly profit margins. Code 204, missing signature, denied. Code 318, pre-existing condition, unverified, denied. Code 402B, treatment deemed not medically necessary, denied, denied, denied. And then there was Silas. We weren't friends. Don't picture some heartwarming movie montage where the old wise mentor gives the troubled young man life advice. Silas didn't talk. I didn't even know if he possessed vocal cords. He was just a fixture of basement level 4, a ghost in a grease-stained jumpsuit whose entire existence revolved around feeding mountains of paper into an industrial shredder. The machine was a monstrous thing, a rusted steel beast that sounded like a jet engine choking on wet gravel. It vibrated the concrete floor so hard it made your teeth ache. We shared the employee break room at 3 a.m. It was a miserable little box lit by flickering fluorescent tubes that made everyone look like they had jaundice. I'd bring a thermos of cheap drip coffee from home, pour him a styrofoam cup, and push it across the scuffed Formica table. He'd nod once. That was the extent of our social interaction. We'd sit in that windowless room, bathed in the sickly hum of the vending machine, drinking bitter coffee while he mindlessly flipped the lid of that brass Zippo lighter. Click, clack, click, clack. It was the metronome of our shared misery, the only sound that cut through the oppressive silence of the basement. I used to wonder what he was shredding down there. Aegis generated literal tons of paper, patient histories, internal memos, financial audits, risk assessments. Silas just fed the beast, hour after hour, shift after shift. His hands were covered in paper cuts that never seemed to heal, the skin stained permanently gray from printer ink. I thought he was just a broken old man, completely institutionalized, riding out the clock until retirement or death, whichever came first. Turns out, the corporation beat retirement to the punch. When I got back to my apartment the morning after he died, the sun was just coming up, painting the smog over the city in bruised shades of purple and sickly yellow. My apartment was a third-floor walk-up in a neighborhood the cops only visited when they had to. It smelled permanently of boiled cabbage, damp drywall, and despair. I unlocked the deadbolt, the metal grinding against the frame, and pushed the door open. The kitchen counter was buried under a snowdrift of final notice bills. Final notice from the electric company, threatening shutoff in 48 hours. Final notice from the landlord, taped to the door last Tuesday, and sitting right on top, mocking me with its crisp white corporate letterhead, was the latest denial letter from my own employer regarding my mother's next round of treatments. Not medically necessary. She was suffocating in her own fluids, her ankles swollen to the size of grapefruits, but some invisible algorithm in a glass tower decided she wasn't worth the investment yet. I dropped my keys on the table, my hands shaking from bone-deep exhaustion and too much cheap caffeine. I reached into my jacket pocket for a piece of cinnamon gum to get the taste of the night shift out of my mouth, and my fingers brushed against cold metal. The lighter. I pulled it out. It was heavier than it should have been. Tarnished brass, scratched and dented from years of riding around in Silas's pocket. I stood there in my suffocating little kitchen, turning it over in my palm. Why did I even take it? Maybe because seeing that HR suit throw a man's entire life into a dumpster triggered something feral and angry in me. Maybe I just wanted proof that Silas had actually existed, that he wasn't just another asset successfully liquidated by human resources to save on a pension payout. I flicked the lid open. Click. But there was no spark wheel, no wick, no smell of lighter fluid. The entire insert had been hollowed out. Jammed inside the metal casing, wrapped tightly in a piece of black electrical tape to stop it from rattling, was a small, high-capacity USB flash drive. I stared at it. The apartment was dead quiet, save for the rhythmic, maddening dripping of the leaky bathroom faucet. My heart started a slow, heavy pounding against my ribs, echoing in my ears. Silas didn't own a computer. The guy still used a rotary payphone in the lobby to call for a cab when it rained. What the hell was a geriatric shredder operator doing with a flash drive hidden like a Cold War spy drop? I pulled my laptop out from under a pile of laundry on the thrift store couch. It was a garbage machine, a refurbished brick with a cracked screen and a battery that died if you unplugged it, but it booted up. I sat at the edge of my unmade bed, the mattress springs groaning under my weight. I peeled the electrical tape off the drive. My palms were sweating, making the plastic slick. I slotted the drive into the USB port. A folder popped up on the desktop. No name, just a string of random alphanumeric characters. I took a breath, the air stalling in my lungs, and double-clicked it. Inside were hundreds of PDF documents, Excel spreadsheets, and encrypted internal email archives. The timestamps went back nearly 5 years. I opened the first spreadsheet. It was a dense wall of data, rows and columns of patient ID numbers, zip codes, and medical billing codes. But it was the final column that made my breath catch in my throat. It was labeled Projected Savings, Terminal Outcome. I didn't understand what I was looking at. Not at first. My brain refused to process the sheer scale of the sociopathy. I opened an email thread dated from 6 months ago. It was an exchange between the chief financial officer and the head of the risk assessment division. The subject line read, Algorithm Optimization Phase 3 Urban Demographics. The words on the screen started to blur, then sharpen with terrifying, crystal clarity. They weren't just denying claims based on medical necessity or missing paperwork. They had built a predictive algorithm that specifically targeted low-income demographics in urban centers. The system was designed to automatically trigger a labyrinth of bureaucratic delays, endless appeals processes, and deliberate misfilings for patients with high-cost chronic illnesses. Cancer, kidney failure, heart disease. The algorithm calculated the exact statistical probability of when a patient or their family would simply run out of money, run out of energy, and give up trying to fight the system. Or, better yet, it calculated when they would just die. They called it attrition modeling in the emails. They discussed it like they were talking about optimizing a supply chain for paper towels. I called it murder by spreadsheet. I kept clicking. Document after document. PowerPoint presentations celebrating record-breaking quarterly profits that were directly correlated to the successful implementation of delayed care protocols. They knew exactly how many people would die because of the delays. They had a literal, acceptable casualty quota. It was mathematically cheaper to let these people die and settle the occasional wrongful death lawsuit out of court than it was to pay for the expensive, life-saving treatments. Silas hadn't just been shredding old payroll receipts and expired contracts. He had been the designated executioner for their paper trail. They sent the most damning physical evidence down to the basement trusting the deaf, invisible old man to turn their sins into confetti and haul it out to the trash. But Silas hadn't destroyed everything. He'd been skimming for years. He'd been scanning the most incriminating documents before feeding the rest to the machine, quietly building a digital graveyard of their victims right under their noses. My eyes burned. The screen glared back at me, an undeniable ledger of corporate evil. I opened a subfolder labeled Active Attrition Targets, Q2. I hit Control F. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely hit the keys. I typed in my mother's last name. The screen jumped. A row highlighted in bright, clinical yellow. There she was. Patient ID 8492B. Status denial cycle 4. Projected attrition date 6 weeks from now. They weren't just rejecting her claims because of some policy technicality. They were systematically bleeding the clock, waiting for her body to finally give out so they could post a fraction of a % better dividend for their shareholders in the fall. I slammed the laptop shut. The silence in the room was suddenly deafening. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating, like I was drowning in the middle of my own living room. Silas knew. He sat in that break room, drinking my cheap coffee, flipping that lighter, knowing exactly what the company was doing to people like my mother. Why didn't he say anything? Why did he leave it for me? I grabbed the Zippo from the bed, the brass cold and heavy against my skin. It wasn't a gift. It was a loaded gun. And he had just handed it to a man with absolutely nothing left to lose. I looked at the stack of final notices on my counter. I looked at the closed laptop. If I took this to the police, the corporate lawyers would bury it in litigation for decades. They'd bury me. I'd end up in a cell or dead in an alley, and my mother would die in a crowded county ward, smelling of urine and despair. If I took it to the press, maybe it makes the evening news for a night, but Aegis pays a fine that amounts to pocket change for them, and the executives go retire on a private island. But there was a third option. I worked in data entry. I had access to the internal network. I didn't just have their confession, I was sitting inside their house. I didn't want justice anymore. Justice was a fairy tale for people who could afford good lawyers. I wanted to burn the whole damn house to the ground. Burning a company down from the inside sounds cinematic. If you watch enough movies, you start to think it's just about typing some green code into a black terminal, hitting the enter key, and watching the corporate logo melt off the screen. The reality is incredibly boring, intensely bureaucratic, and terrifyingly slow. Aegis Healthcare didn't become a multi-billion-dollar behemoth by leaving their digital front door unlocked. Every data entry terminal on the third floor was essentially a digital straitjacket. We operated on a closed intranet loop. My computer didn't even have a functioning web browser. If I tried to plug Silas's flash drive into my workstation and email the files to a journalist, the system would immediately flag the unrecognized hardware, lock my terminal, and dispatch a security team to my cubicle before I could even get out of my chair. They treated our workstations like we were handling weapons-grade plutonium, which, considering what those denial codes actually did to people, wasn't entirely inaccurate. I needed a machine with unfiltered access to the external internet. I needed an administrative terminal. I needed Vance. Vance was our floor supervisor. He was a 34-year-old corporate climber who wore suits that were tailored slightly too tight, drank protein shakes at his desk, and smelled aggressively of sandalwood cologne. He was the kind of guy who unironically used words like synergy and bandwidth during our mandatory 10 p.m. shift briefings. More importantly, Vance had a private office in the corner of the floor, and because his title had the word director in it, his computer bypassed the standard firewall restrictions. He could browse the open web, stream podcasts, and upload whatever he wanted. The plan was crude, built out of desperation and sleep deprivation. I was going to wait until Vance took his mandatory 2:15 a.m. smoke break. He had this rigid routine. Every night at exactly 2:15, he would take the freight elevator down to the loading dock to smoke 2 American Spirit cigarettes in total silence. It usually took him exactly 12 minutes. 12 minutes to sneak into his office, wake up his machine, plug in the Zippo, dump the 14 gigabytes of internal documents onto an encrypted cloud server I had rented for $6, and get back to my desk before my own metrics flagged me for being idle. Wednesday night. The air outside was freezing. A bitter Chicago wind cutting through my thin jacket as I walked from the bus stop to the Aegis complex. The building looked like a massive glass monolith jutting out of the concrete, entirely unbothered by the human suffering it was processing inside. Walking through the lobby security checkpoint was the first hurdle. They had metal detectors. I usually toss my keys and phone into the plastic bin without thinking, but tonight, the brass Zippo felt like it weighed 50 pounds in my pocket. If the guard picked it up, flipped the lid, and saw the black electrical tape instead of a wick, it was over. My mother's life, my freedom, Silas's last act of defiance, all of it gone before I even clocked in. I approached the conveyor belt. The security guard, a heavyset guy named Miller who usually spent his shift watching sports highlights on his phone, barely looked up. I dropped my phone, my keys, and the lighter into the gray bin and shoved it forward. I walked through the detector. No beep. I waited on the other side, watching the bin slide down the rollers. Miller glanced at the screen, stifled a yawn, and looked away. I grabbed my things, my fingers closing around the cold brass of the lighter, and walked to the elevators. My shirt was completely soaked in sweat beneath my arms. The shift started at 10. Sitting at my desk that night was a specific kind of psychological torture. For the first 4 hours, I had to do my job. I had to look at the screen, read the claims, and apply the codes. But now, I knew the secret. I knew that every time I pulled up a file for a patient living in a specific zip code, the algorithm was quietly flagging them. I saw it happening in real time. I processed a claim for a 60-year-old woman needing a bone marrow transplant. The system generated a code 412, incomplete primary physician authorization. I knew for a fact her authorization was there. I could see it attached to the digital file. But the algorithm deliberately unlinked the PDF, forcing a denial, forcing a review process that would take another 90 days. 90 days she probably didn't have. I looked around the room. There were 80 other data entry clerks sitting in a vast sea of gray fabric cubicles. The only sound was the frantic clacking of keyboards and the low, droning hum of the ventilation system. They were just trying to pay their rent. They were just trying to feed their kids. They had no idea they were manning the digital gas chambers. I chewed my cinnamon gum until it lost all its flavor, staring at the clock at the bottom right of my screen. 1:45 a.m. 2 a.m. 2 a.m. I saw Vance stand up from his glass-walled office in the corner. He stretched his arms over his head, grabbed his coat off the back of his expensive ergonomic chair, and patted his pockets. He walked out, his hard-soled shoes clicking sharply against the cheap industrial carpet. He didn't lock the door. The thermostat in his office had been broken for a week, pumping out too much heat, so he always left the door cracked about 2 inches to let the cool air from the bullpen circulate. I waited 3 minutes. At 2:13 a.m., I stood up. I grabbed a stack of blank printouts to make it look like I was heading to the heavy-duty copy machine, which was conveniently located right past Vance's office. The floor was mostly empty, half the staff on their lunch break in the cafeteria downstairs. I walked down the aisle, keeping my eyes fixed straight ahead. My heart was beating so hard I could feel the pulse vibrating in my teeth. I reached the copy machine, tossed the papers on top of it, and took 2 quick steps to the left, slipping through the crack in Vance's door. I pulled the door shut behind me until it clicked. The sudden silence in the office was deafening. It smelled overwhelmingly of that sandalwood cologne and stale coffee. I moved behind his desk. His monitor was asleep. I tapped the spacebar. The screen flared to life, illuminating the room in a harsh white glow. A password prompt. I froze. I hadn't thought about the password. Why the hell didn't I think about the password? I assumed because he was just stepping out for a smoke, he wouldn't lock his machine. A wave of pure, unadulterated panic washed over me. I stood there staring at the blinking cursor, my mind going entirely blank. I had 9 minutes left. I looked around the desk. Sticky notes. People like Vance, people who use corporate buzzwords and bought expensive chairs, were usually incredibly lazy when it came to actual security. I lifted his keyboard. Nothing. I opened the top drawer. Pens, breath mints, business cards. I looked at the framed photos on his desk. his wife, his golden retriever, his kid. The kid was wearing a baseball jersey. The number 12. I typed in the dog's name from a small plaque on a paperweight. Buster12. Incorrect password. I swallowed hard. My throat felt like sandpaper. 8 minutes. I looked at the monitor again. There was a small Aegis Healthcare sticky note stuck to the bottom bezel. It just had a string of numbers. 041189. I typed it in. Incorrect. 7 minutes. I was going to fail. I was going to walk back to my desk, sit down, and spend the rest of my life watching people like my mother die on a computer screen. I leaned over the desk, bracing my weight on my hands, trying to breathe. My eyes locked onto a small, leather-bound notebook sitting next to his mouse pad. It was open. Vance had been taking notes from a conference call. At the top of the page, underlined twice, was the word Synergy 2026. I typed it in. Synergy 2026. The screen unlocked. I let out a breath that sounded like a sob. I pulled the Zippo from my pocket, ripped the electrical tape off with my fingernails, and jammed the drive into the USB port on the side of the monitor. The folder popped up. The graveyard of documents Silas had spent years compiling. I opened the browser. I didn't go to the regular internet. Earlier that afternoon, I had memorized the exact URL for a secure, anonymous Dropbox utilized by a consortium of investigative journalists based out of Europe. They specialized in corporate whistleblowing. You upload the data, their automated systems scrub the origin IP, and they distribute it to 50 different news organizations simultaneously. You couldn't stop it once it started. I typed the URL. The page loaded. A simple black screen with a white upload button. I dragged the master folder containing all 14 gigabytes of data over to the browser. The screen darkened, and a progress bar appeared in the center of the monitor. Calculating time remaining. Estimating time remaining. 8 minutes, 45 seconds. I looked at my watch. It was 2:18 a.m. Vance usually got back by 2:27 a.m. It was going to be incredibly close. If the network throttled the speed, if someone started downloading a massive file somewhere else in the building, I was dead. I stood there, watching the green bar crawl across the screen. 10%, 15%. Every pixel it moved felt like an hour. The silence in the office was suffocating. I couldn't pace. I couldn't move. I just stared at the screen, grinding my teeth, listening to the faint hum of the computer tower. 35%. Time remaining, 5 minutes. It was 2:21 a.m. Then I heard it. Out in the bullpen. The distinct, sharp clicking of hard-soled shoes on the industrial carpet. Someone was walking down the aisle. Walking fast. I ducked down behind the desk, my knees hitting the floor hard. I held my breath. The footsteps got louder. They were coming toward the corner office. It wasn't Vance. Vance took his time. These footsteps were heavy, urgent. Through the frosted glass of the office wall, I saw a blurred, dark silhouette stop right outside the door. I saw a hand reach out and touch the doorknob. The progress bar on the screen above me read 52%. Time remaining, 4 minutes. The doorknob started to turn. The doorknob turned. It didn't swing open with some dramatic, cinematic flair. It just clicked. The heavy wood pushing inward with an agonizing squeak of unoiled hinges. I was pressed so hard against the modesty panel of Vance's desk that the sharp edge of the wood was physically biting into my spine. I stopped breathing. I literally forced my lungs to freeze. Through the narrow gap between the bottom of the desk and the industrial carpet, I saw a pair of scuffed, black tactical boots step into the room. Not Vance. Vance wore imported leather Oxfords. These were the cheap, heavy boots issued to the building's night security detail. The boots stopped right in the middle of the office. The progress bar on the monitor above my head was glowing with a harsh, radioactive green light. 58%. I didn't need to look up to know the security guard was staring straight at the screen. You don't walk into a dark office at 2 in the morning and ignore the only monitor that's lit up, actively transferring a massive data packet to a black-screened external IP address. "Hey," a voice said. It was a young voice. maybe early 20s, cracking slightly with uncertainty. Who's in here? He took a step closer to the desk. I could hear the heavy jingle of the key ring attached to his tactical belt. He was reaching for his radio. I knew the protocol. If he keyed that mic and called in an unauthorized data breach, the network administrators on the 7th floor would remotely sever the internet connection to this entire quadrant of the building in less than 10 seconds. They had an automated kill switch specifically designed to stop corporate espionage. If that happened, the upload dies at 60%. The files are fragmented, corrupted, useless. The journalists get a pile of digital garbage, and I go to federal prison for the rest of my natural life. I didn't think. If I had thought about it, I would have stayed under the desk and begged for mercy. Instead, pure, unfiltered panic hijacked my nervous system. I lunged upward. I hit the underside of the desk with my shoulder, sending Vance's expensive ergonomic keyboard clattering to the floor. I stood up, gasping for air, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The security guard stumbled backward, his hand instinctively dropping from his radio down to the heavy flashlight on his belt. He was just a kid. He had acne scars on his cheeks and eyes, completely wide with shock. His name tag read, Gutierrez. "Step away from the terminal," Gutierrez stammered, his voice trying to find an authoritative register and failing completely. He pulled the flashlight, holding it up like a club. "Step away right now, man. I'm calling this in. Listen to me," I said. My voice sounded foreign, hollow, and desperate. I held both my hands up, palms facing him, trying to look as non-threatening as a guy sweating profusely at 2:25 a.m. could possibly look. "Just give me 2 minutes. That's all I need. 2 minutes, and I'll walk out of here with you. I'll let you put the cuffs on me." Gutierrez looked at the screen. I risked a glance. 74%. 3 minutes remaining. The network was throttling. "I don't know what you're downloading, but you need to back up," he said, his thumb hovering over the orange emergency button on his shoulder radio. "You don't even work on this floor. You're from data entry. Put your hands on the wall." "They're killing people," I blurted out. The words just vomited out of my mouth. "The company, Aegis, they have an algorithm. They're deliberately denying claims to let sick people die so they can save money. My mom is one of them. I have the proof. It's uploading to the press right now." Gutierrez froze. For exactly 2 seconds, the corporate programming in his head short-circuited against basic human empathy. He looked at my face, looking for a lie, looking for a crazy person. I just stared back, tears of pure adrenaline burning the corners of my eyes. "Man, I just work security," he whispered, shaking his head, his training kicking back in. "I can't let you do this." He lunged for the computer tower sitting on the floor, aiming to physically rip the Ethernet cable out of the back of the machine. I moved. I didn't throw a punch. I didn't know how to fight. I just threw my entire body weight into him. We collided awkwardly, a tangle of limbs and cheap fabric. We hit the floor hard. The impact knocked the wind completely out of my lungs, a sharp burst of pain shooting up my collarbone. Gutierrez was younger, stronger, and heavier. He immediately rolled, pinning my shoulder to the carpet, his knee driving into my ribs. "Stop!" he yelled, grabbing his radio with his free hand. I thrashed wildly, my fingers clawing at the carpet. I grabbed the leg of Vance's chair and yanked it violently toward us. The heavy metal base slammed into Gutierrez's shin. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening just for a fraction of a second. I shoved him off me, scrambling backward on my hands and knees like a feral animal. I hit the desk and pulled myself up. 91%, 60 seconds remaining. Gutierrez was getting up, his face flushed red with anger now. He wasn't scared anymore, he was pissed off. He unclipped his radio, pressing the mic button. "Control, this is Unit 4. I have a physical altercation and a 1-0, 30 inches progress on the 3rd floor. Director's office. Shut down the 3rd floor network node. Now!" Copy that. Unit 4. Node shutdown initiated. The voice on the radio was distorted but incredibly calm. A digital countdown appeared on the bottom right of the computer screen. A network kill switch protocol, 10 seconds. I looked at the upload bar. 96%. It was a race between two progress bars. I gripped the edge of the desk so hard my knuckles turned entirely white. Gutierrez was rushing me again, his flashlight raised. 98%. 6 seconds on the kill switch. 99%. 4 seconds. Gutierrez tackled me against the glass wall of the office. The glass bowed outward with a terrifying creak. My head cracked against the pane, a flash of white light exploding behind my eyes. I reached out blindly, my hand slapping against the monitor. 100%. The screen flashed green. A small text box popped up. Upload confirmed. Package secured. I grabbed the brass Zippo lighter sticking out of the USB port and yanked it out so hard the metal port bent. A split second later, the screen went completely black. The kill switch had activated, but it was too late. The ghost had already left the machine. I shoved Gutierrez away with a sudden, violent burst of strength I didn't know I possessed. He stumbled backward over the overturned chair. I didn't wait to see if he was getting back up. I bolted out the door. The third-floor bullpen was no longer quiet. The silent alarm had triggered the overhead lights. The sickening yellow glow was replaced by blinding, surgical white emergency halogens. Data entry clerks were standing up in their cubicles, peering over the fabric walls with confused, sleepy faces. "Hey! Stop him!" Gutierrez yelled from the office, his voice echoing across the vast room. I ran. I sprinted down the main aisle, my boots slipping on the slick carpet. The air in my lungs tasted like copper and dust. I hit the heavy fire doors leading to the central stairwell and pushed my entire body weight against the crash bar. The door flew open, slamming against the concrete wall. The alarms started blaring. Not a bell, but a high-pitched, electronic siren that drilled directly into the center of your skull. I bypassed the elevators. They would be shut down or waiting with security guards. I took the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, my hand burning as it slid down the metal railing. Second floor? First floor? I didn't stop at the lobby. The lobby was a fortress. I kept running down basement level 1, level 2, level 3, basement level 4. I kicked the stairwell door open. The air down here was instantly different. It was freezing cold, smelling of ozone, damp concrete, and that sickening synthetic green apple air freshener. Silas's domain. I could hear the heavy thud of boots echoing down the stairwell behind me. They were converging. I ran through the maze of chain-link storage cages, my shadow stretching and warping against the concrete walls under the flickering fluorescent tubes. I knew this basement. I knew where the blind spots for the cameras were because I used to watch Silas navigate them every single night. I reached the shredder room. The massive steel machine sat completely silent in the center of the room, looking like a dormant mechanical beast. For a second, just a fraction of a heartbeat, I thought I saw Silas standing by the control panel, holding a styrofoam cup of coffee. Just a trick of the shadows. But it gave me the exact bearing I needed. Behind the shredder was the secondary loading dock, the one they only used for hazardous waste removal. The door was heavy, reinforced steel, alarmed, and magnetically locked. But Silas had showed me something once, without ever saying a word. He had kicked a very specific electrical junction box on the wall when the door jammed. I grabbed a heavy metal fire extinguisher off the wall. I swung it like a baseball bat, smashing it directly into the gray plastic cover of the junction box. Sparks showered over my arms, stinging my skin. The magnetic lock on the heavy steel door disengaged with a loud, metallic clack. I pushed the door open and threw myself out into the night. The Chicago winter hit me like a physical blow. The air was probably 10 degrees, the wind howling off Lake Michigan, cutting straight through my sweat-soaked shirt. I scrambled up the concrete ramp of the loading dock, slipping on a patch of black ice, tearing the denim of my jeans and scraping my knee raw. I didn't feel it. The adrenaline was a narcotic, masking everything. I ran down the alley, vaulting over a pile of frozen trash bags, and burst out onto the empty street. I kept running for 6 blocks, never looking back, until my lungs physically refused to take in any more air. I collapsed against the cold brick wall of a closed pawn shop, sliding down to the frozen sidewalk. I sat there in the dark, my chest heaving, the icy air burning my throat. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the brass Zippo. It was perfectly intact. I stared at it for a long time. Then, I placed it on the concrete curb, raised my heavy work boot, and brought my heel down on it with every ounce of strength I had left. The brass casing crushed. The plastic USB drive inside snapped into a dozen jagged pieces. I scooped the debris into my hand, walked over to the storm drain at the corner of the street, and dropped it in. I watched it vanish into the black water below. The physical crash hit me exactly 10 minutes later. The adrenaline evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow shell of exhaustion and terror. My hands started shaking so violently I couldn't put them in my pockets. I vomited bile into a trash can on the corner of 43rd Street. I walked the remaining 2 miles to my apartment. The sky was turning a pale, bruised gray. Morning was coming. I unlocked my door. The apartment was exactly the same as I had left it. The leaky faucet was still dripping. The final notices were still piled on the counter. But everything was different. I was unemployed. I was a criminal. I was hunted. I sat on my unmade bed, pulling my broken laptop onto my lap. It was 6:15 a.m. I opened a browser window. I didn't check my company email. I knew it would be locked out. I went straight to the news aggregator sites. Nothing. Just local politics and sports scores. For an hour, I sat there, the silence of the apartment crushing me. Had the kill switch stopped it? Had the encrypted Dropbox failed? Had I just thrown away my entire life, my mother's only source of income, for absolutely nothing? At 7:42 a.m., my screen refreshed. It started as a single article on an independent investigative journalism blog. The headline was simple, entirely unsensationalized, which somehow made it more terrifying. The Aegis algorithm inside the healthcare giant's calculated casualty quota. 10 minutes later, the New York Times published their piece, then the Washington Post. By 8:30 a.m., CNN was running it as breaking news. The internet was catching fire. The files Silas had gathered, the spreadsheets outlining the exact cost-benefit analysis of letting human beings die, were being downloaded and shared by thousands of people every second. I watched the stock ticker at the bottom of a news stream. Aegis Healthcare opened the trading day. Within 14 minutes, their stock price plummeted by 22%. It was a free fall. My phone vibrated on the mattress next to me. The screen lit up. It was my mother's number. I stared at the glowing name on the cracked glass. I had burned down the machine. The truth was out. But as I listened to the phone buzz against the cheap fabric of the bed, a terrifying realization washed over me. I had destroyed the company that was trying to kill her, but in doing so, I had also destroyed the only health insurance policy keeping her alive. I picked up the phone. Marcus? Her voice was thin. Too thin. Like old paper that might tear if you spoke too loudly. Are you watching the news? I told her I was. She sounded confused, frightened, but not angry. Not yet. The dialysis clinic had just called her. They were turning patients away at the front door. Aegis Healthcare had initiated a catastrophic, system-wide lockdown protocols across all their subsidiaries. The clinic couldn't access patient portals, couldn't verify billing codes, and legally, they couldn't hook anyone up to the life-saving machines without the liability waivers processing through the corporate mainframe. They said there was some kind of massive cyber attack. She coughed, a wet, rattling sound deep in her chest that made my stomach physically twist into knots. They told me to go to the county hospital emergency room if the swelling in my legs gets worse. You know how county is, baby. People die in those waiting rooms. You sit in a plastic chair for 14 hours just hoping a doctor makes eye contact with you. I gripped the edge of the mattress so hard my fingernails bit into my own palms. I had successfully burned the monster to the ground, but the monster was holding the only key to her survival. I had triggered a massive collateral damage radius, and my own mother was standing right at ground zero. Mom, listen to me, I said, trying to force the tremor out of my voice. You're going to be okay. I'm going to figure this out. I promise. Why do you sound so out of breath? She asked. A mother always knows. Even through a cracked phone speaker, even through her own exhaustion, she could hear the sheer, unadulterated terror vibrating in my chest. I just ran up the stairs. I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I love you. I'll call you back from a different number soon. I hung up before she could ask why I would need a different number. I didn't have time to mourn the bitter ironies of what I had just done. I walked over to the window, pulling the cheap plastic blinds down just enough to peek through the cracked slats. Down on the street, the morning commute was starting in the freezing Chicago air. Normal people in heavy winter coats were walking to the bus stop, holding paper coffee cups, completely oblivious to the fact that the digital architecture of the city was currently ripping itself apart. Then, I heard them. Sirens. Not the slow, lazy, sweeping wail of a passing ambulance. It was the sharp, aggressive, overlapping yelp of multiple police cruisers cutting violently through the morning traffic. 3 black Ford Explorers with flashing red and blue lights tore around the corner of 43rd Street, their tires screeching harshly against the frozen asphalt. They weren't slowing down to read street signs. They weren't looking around. They knew exactly where they were going. My building. Aegis didn't just call the local precinct. When you leak 14 gigabytes of highly classified proprietary corporate data and tank $1 billion stock portfolio before breakfast, you don't get the beat cops. You get the federal government. You get the cyber terrorism division. You get treated like a threat to national security. They had Vance's computer terminal. They had the security footage of me tackling Gutierrez in the office. They had my employee file, my home address, my emergency contacts, and my social security number. I wasn't some anonymous, untouchable hacker sitting in a basement in Eastern Europe. I was a desperate data entry clerk who had left a trail of digital breadcrumbs a mile wide. I had exactly 60 seconds before they kicked down the front door of my building. I didn't pack a bag. Bags slow you down. Bags make you look like a fugitive on the run. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed all the cash I had hidden in an old coffee tin above the stove, $340 in crumpled bills, and shoved it deep into my front jeans pocket. I grabbed a heavy gray hoodie, threw it on over my torn, blood-stained work shirt, and pulled the hood up over my head. I didn't go out the front door. My apartment had a rusted fire escape window in the kitchen that overlooked a narrow, trash-filled service alley. The metal grate was rusted completely shut from years of harsh winters. I grabbed a cast iron skillet from the stovetop and smashed it against the latch over and over until the brittle iron finally snapped. I shoved the window up, the freezing air hitting my face like a physical slap, and climbed out onto the rusted metal platform. Just as my boots hit the metal grating outside, I heard the heavy, synchronized thud of tactical boots hitting the stairs inside the building. "Federal agents! Open the door!" The voice was muffled through the cheap drywall, but it carried the terrifying weight of absolute authority. A fraction of a second later, the unmistakable, explosive sound of a heavy battering ram splintering my front door frame echoed through the small apartment. I scrambled down the fire escape, my boots clanging loudly against the metal stairs. I didn't bother with the drop-down ladder. I jumped the last 10 feet, landing hard in a pile of frozen garbage bags. I didn't stop to check if I had sprained an ankle. I just ran. I kept my head down, avoiding the main avenues, sticking strictly to the narrow service alleys and the walkways behind the boarded-up bodegas. Every security camera mounted on a brick wall or hanging from a traffic light felt like a sniper rifle pointed directly at the back of my head. I worked in data. I knew exactly how the system functioned. Facial recognition software could pull my image from a grainy ATM camera and flag my exact GPS coordinates to a federal database in less than 3 seconds. I was a ghost trying to navigate a city made entirely of surveillance glass. I ended up in a dingy, 24-hour laundromat on the far edge of the south side roughly 2 hours later. It smelled heavily of cheap powdered detergent, stale bleach, and wet lint. I sat in a molded plastic chair in the back corner, pretending to intensely watch a load of someone else's towels spin endlessly in a commercial dryer. An older woman folding faded children's clothes 2 rows over didn't even look up at me. She was fighting her own war. Mounted above the coin change machine was a small, boxy television tuned to a cable news network. The volume was muted, but the bold, scrolling closed captions across the bottom of the screen told the entire story. The Aegis Healthcare headquarters had been raided. Live helicopter footage showed men and women in dark windbreakers with bright yellow FBI letters across the back carrying cardboard boxes of hard drives and servers out of the pristine glass lobby. The chief financial officer had reportedly been detained at O'Hare Airport trying to board a private jet. The company's stock had completely collapsed, and trading had been officially halted by the SEC to prevent a wider market panic. It was a massacre. Silas's revenge, executed perfectly from beyond the grave. The algorithmic executioner had been dragged out of the basement and slaughtered in the town square for the whole world to see. But then, the broadcast cut away from the helicopter footage to a new, full-screen graphic. A photo of my face. It was my Aegis employee badge picture, blown up, color-corrected to make me look sinister, and plastered right next to the word "Wanted" in massive red letters. The captions crawled across the screen with terrifying, calculated indifference. Federal authorities are executing a massive manhunt for Marcus Vance, a former Aegis employee, in connection with a catastrophic data breach. Sources inside the company suggest Vance acted as a disgruntled employee, illegally compromising the highly sensitive medical data of millions of American citizens. He is considered desperate, unstable, and potentially dangerous. They weren't calling me a whistleblower, they were calling me a cyber terrorist. They were masterfully spinning the narrative. Aegis might be going down in flames, but their highly paid crisis PR firms were working overtime to make sure I went down with them. They were painting me as the villain who endangered millions of sick patients by exposing their private medical records to the dark web. They weren't just prosecuting me, they were assassinating my character in real time. I sat in that hard plastic chair, shivering uncontrollably under the gray hoodie, the $300 burning a hole in my pocket. I had no passport, I had no car, I had no burner phone. Just a bruised shoulder, a scraped knee, and the paralyzing, suffocating realization that I could never go home again. I couldn't visit my mother in the hospital. I couldn't even call her to tell her I was alive without giving away my exact location. I was completely and utterly erased from society, just like Silas. Only I still had to figure out how to keep breathing. 14 months. That is exactly how long it takes for the 24-hour news cycle to completely forget about the largest corporate whistleblowing event in American history. It's also exactly how long I have been a ghost. I don't live in Chicago anymore. I live in a rusted-out, former logging town in the Pacific Northwest. A place where the rain never really stops and the heavy, gray clouds sit so low they scrape the tops of the pine trees. I don't use the name Marcus. I don't use banks. I don't have a lease, a credit card, or a digital footprint. I rent a damp, uninsulated room above a detached garage from a guy who asks 0 questions as long as I hand him $300 in crumpled cash on the 1st of every month. I work the graveyard shift washing dishes at a 24-hour truck stop on the edge of the interstate. My hands are permanently cracked, the skin peeling and raw from the cheap industrial degreaser they use in the sinks. Sometimes, when the diner is empty at 4 in the morning and the only sound is the low, vibrating hum of the commercial refrigerator, I look down at my ruined, graying hands and I think about Silas. I finally understand him. I understand why he never spoke. When you know exactly how the machine works, and you know exactly what it takes to break it, you realize that words are entirely useless. The fallout from the Aegis Healthcare leak was biblical, but it wasn't a fairy tale. If you expected to see a lineup of billionaire executives led away in handcuffs to spend the rest of their lives rotting in a federal penitentiary, you don't understand how America actually works. The system protects its own. There were congressional hearings, of course, weeks of televised grandstanding where politicians feigned absolute outrage for the cameras. The chief executive officer sat at a wooden table, flanked by lawyers whose suits cost more than I made in a decade, and claimed he had absolutely no knowledge of the attrition algorithm. He blamed a rogue division of data scientists. He blamed a glitch in the risk assessment software. He resigned with a $40 million severance package. He ultimately served exactly 11 months in a minimum security, white-collar facility that looked more like an exclusive country club than a prison. Vance, my old floor supervisor, took a plea deal, flipped on the regional directors, and walked away with probation. But Aegis is dead. The stock never recovered. The federal fines completely bankrupted the parent company, and their assets were liquidated and sold off for scrap. More importantly, the algorithm was exposed, dragged out into the harsh light of day, and dismantled. Congress hastily passed a bipartisan bill outlawing the use of predictive mortality software in healthcare claim processing. They call it the Fletcher-Vance Act. A beautiful, sterile piece of legislation named after the old man who stole the data and the fugitive who leaked it. Independent auditors estimate that the destruction of that algorithm saved roughly 42,000 lives in the first 6 months alone. 42,000 people who were scheduled to be quietly, efficiently erased by a spreadsheet are still breathing today. But my mother isn't one of them. The total system lockdown that Aegis initiated on the morning of the leak lasted for 5 full days. 5 days of complete digital paralysis across their entire network of clinics and subsidiary hospitals. Without the billing portal, without the liability waivers, the dialysis clinic couldn't process her. They sent her to the county hospital emergency room, just like she told me they would. County General was already a war zone on a good day. When Aegis locked their doors, thousands of desperate, critically ill patients flooded the public system all at once. It was a catastrophic bottleneck. My mother sat in a hard plastic chair in a crowded, unventilated hallway for 22 hours. She couldn't breathe. Her lungs were slowly filling with the fluid her failing kidneys could no longer process. By the time a resident doctor finally got to her, her heart was under too much strain. She went into cardiac arrest on a gurney in the hallway, surrounded by strangers, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. She died on a Thursday, exactly 48 hours after I plugged that brass lighter into Vance's computer. I burned down the monster to save her, but the monster was the only thing keeping her alive. I pulled the trigger, knowing the blast radius would be massive, but I arrogantly thought I could shield her from the fire. That is the cruelest, most suffocating irony of my existence. I traded my mother's life for the lives of 42,000 strangers. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to. But the math is undeniable. It's a terrifying, brutal equation that I have to wake up and swallow every single. I couldn't even go to her funeral. The FBI had the cemetery staked out. I know, because I watched the burial from a wooded hillside nearly a mile away, looking through a pair of cheap, scratched binoculars I bought at a pawn shop. I watched 2 men in dark windbreakers standing casually near the back of the small gathering of our extended family. I watched the heavy wooden casket lower into the frozen Chicago dirt, and I couldn't even walk down there to throw a handful of soil on top of it. I stood in the freezing rain, my face completely numb, and watched the only person who ever truly loved me get buried while I hid behind a tree like a coward. They are still looking for me. My face is still on the federal watch lists. I am the radical cyber terrorist who destabilized the healthcare market. The media painted me as a disgruntled, unstable maniac who recklessly endangered millions. They never mentioned the lives saved. They only focused on the chaos I caused. If a police officer pulls me over for a broken taillight in this miserable little town, my life is over. I will spend the next 40 years in a federal supermax facility. So, I keep my head down. I walk to work in the dark. I wash the dishes. I take out the trash. I have become the man in the basement. Last week, I walked into a convenience store at 3 a.m. to buy a pack of cheap coffee. Sitting next to the cash register was a small cardboard display of metal lighters. They weren't brass. They were cheap, chrome-plated garbage that probably cost $2 to manufacture. I bought one. I don't smoke. I've never smoked a day in my life, but I carry it in my pocket now, right next to the crumpled bills and the lint. Every night, when my shift is over, I walk back to my freezing room above the garage. I sit on the edge of the mattress in the dark, listening to the relentless rain hitting the corrugated tin roof. I pull the cold metal lighter out of my pocket. I don't strike the flint. I just push the lid open with my thumb and then snap it shut. Click, clack, click, clack. It's the only sound in the room. The steady, metallic heartbeat of a ghost. I sit there in the dark, flipping the lid, thinking about a deaf old man in a basement, a spreadsheet full of the dead, and a mother sitting in a hallway. I did the right thing. I know I did the right thing. I tore down a machine that was feeding on human misery. But doing the right thing didn't set me free. It just locked me in a different kind of cage. Click, clack. I close my eyes, the smell of cheap degreaser lingering on my hands, and I wait for the sun to come up on a world that doesn't even know I exist.